Mob called Cassius Clay boy. Bumpy Johnson called them corpses. They called him boy in his own streets, laughing loud enough for Harlem to hear. Everyone expected Bumpy Johnson to explode. Instead, he stood still, already counting how many bodies silence would leave behind. Harlem heard the word before Bumpy did. It slid across a card table, spilled from smiling mouth, floated down Lenox Avenue like it belonged there. Boy, said soft, said careless, said by men who had never bled on those sidewalks. Bumpy Johnson didn't lift his head. His fingers stayed folded, heavy rings catching the light. The room waited for thunder. That was the expectation. That was always the mistake. The insult moved faster than violence ever could. It reached barbershops where razors paused midair. It reached women on stoops who stopped talking. It reached men who owed Bumpy favors they paid with silence and time. Calling him boy wasn't just talk. It was a claim, a way of shrinking a man in front of his people. The mob thought names could undo years of order. They thought volume meant power. Bumpy stood, slow enough to feel intentional. He didn't answer the word. He didn't correct it. He simply looked at the man who said it, long enough for fear to recognize itself. In Harlem, explosions were loud but short. Bumpy preferred pressure. He left the room without a threat, without a promise. That was when the neighborhood understood something had already been decided. By nightfall, nobody repeated the insult. Not because they were warned, because Harlem knew when a line had been crossed, and Bumpy Johnson never stepped over lines. He erased them. Men who understood him began locking doors early, turning lights low. Not out of fear, but respect. They knew calm like his only arrived before storms, and storms never asked permission once they finally came. Everyone sensed the streets, holding their breath, waiting for what followed. Harlem didn't need Bumpy to announce himself. The streets whispered it, a quiet acknowledgement that power wasn't always loud. Shopkeepers who counted pennies behind barred windows nodded when his name passed their lips. Boys on corners stepped back, not from fear alone, but from recognition. Authority had a rhythm here, and Bumpy said it. The insult hadn't gone unnoticed. Even now, merchants and runners, men who sold everything from fruit to favors, muttered about it in low tones. They didn't speculate. They knew the answer would come, and that it wouldn't be hasty. It never was. There was a pattern to Bumpy's control, a precision only those who lived under his shadow could read. He walked Harlem slowly, his coat brushing against the winter air, fingers tucked in pockets. No announcements, no proclamations, just presence. Presence enough to bend the night, enough to make the careless understand that respect was currency here, and he was the only one authorized to mint it. Neighborhood elders leaned on canes and walls alike, nodding subtly when he passed. Children stopped in the middle of games, sensing the pulse of the street's shift. Even the dogs seemed quieter, the way corners themselves could hold a story. Bumpy's authority wasn't enforced with fists alone. It was sewn into the fabric of the city, felt in the tilt of a head, the pause in a conversation. By evening, whispers spread through the mob circles. Men who had laughed at the word boy began realizing the neighborhood wasn't laughing with them. Each block, each stoop, each hidden observer painted a picture they couldn't yet fully comprehend. Bumpy Johnson's silence was deliberate. His calm was lethal. His people were watching. No one touched the wrong man without consequence. No one shouted across the streets without judgment. And though Bumpy hadn't struck, the very air carried the weight of the promise he didn't need to voice. Harlem's loyalty, solidified over years of careful rule, began circling the insult like a tightening noose. The city itself became a shield, every alley and doorway a reminder that disrespect toward its king was an act of defiance no one could survive unmarked. By night, the word boy had already shrunk in the minds of its speakers. In Harlem, Bumpy's authority wasn't questioned. It was inherited, and every step he took reinforced the unspoken law. You did not cross him. Outside of Harlem, In dimly lit rooms filled with smoke and false bravado, the word boy was still being whispered. Men who thought themselves untouchable laughed, thinking Bumpy Johnson had been slowed by age, by politics, by the weight of his own reputation. They misread the quiet. They mistook patience for hesitation. The mob, proud and careless, pushed further. They pressed into territory that didn't belong to them. They sent runners, low-level thugs with teeth too sharp and eyes too wide, hoping to provoke a reaction that would mark weakness. They assumed the street silence was compliance. It was not. It was observation. Behind locked doors, Bumpy listened. He didn't shout. He didn't order anyone to strike. He simply measured, counting the arrogance in their words, noting the tremor in the man who laughed the loudest. Every misstep, every overconfident move made their undoing more certain. In his mind, a ledger of offense had already begun to fill, each entry precise and deliberate. They moved openly, thinking that terror could be manufactured. They ignored the rhythm of Harlem, the unspoken loyalty that ran through every block and stairwell. Men who had been taught respect by Bumpy's hand in quieter moments now watched the outsider's arrogance with thinly veiled fury. The mob didn't see it, but Harlem's eyes followed every footstep, every whispered command, every attempted display of strength. Bumpy's power was not in the flash of violence. It was in the control he maintained, the inevitability he cultivated. Every insult, every intrusion, every careless act only tightened the invisible net. They were acting, and he was waiting. They were shouting, and he was silent. The city seemed to lean in. The street lamps flickered with the anticipation of what Harlem had long understood. Disrespect could be forgiven, but it could never go unanswered. And Bumpy Johnson had no intention of letting the record remain clean. In the haze of their miscalculation, the mob thought themselves clever. They thought they had baited a tiger into a corner. But the tiger had already circled them, unseen. Every man who believed Bumpy to be slowed by silence underestimated the man who had made patience into a weapon, who had turned observation into judgment. Every careless laugh, every boastful step was feeding a storm they did not realize had already begun. Harlem waited with him, breathing in unison, aware that the streets did not belong to outsiders. The lesson was simple. You could try to challenge a king, but you could not rewrite the rules he had etched into every alley, every stoop, every shadow. The mob was about to learn that restraint, when wielded by a man like Bumpy Johnson, was far deadlier than rage. The insult returned the next week, louder, sharper, meant to humiliate. This time it wasn't whispered behind doors or spilled carelessly at a table. It was shouted in front of Harlem, a challenge thrown like a gauntlet across the streets. Men and women froze mid-step. The rhythm of daily life paused, all eyes turning toward the man who dared speak. Bumpy Johnson stood at the corner, coat hanging from broad shoulders, hands resting lightly at his sides. The words hit him, but his face remained calm, carved from decades of knowing exactly what silence could do. There was a pause, so long it felt unnatural. The mob expected action, a snap, a storm. Instead, they received something more terrifying. Nothing. Harlem felt it immediately. Respect, once taken for granted, was being tested. Shopkeepers shuttered windows slowly, almost ceremoniously. Street corners emptied, the usual chatter stilled. Children tugged on their mother's sleeves, sensing tension that no adult spoke of aloud. Even the pigeons seemed to hesitate, pecking lightly at the cracked pavement as if the city itself held its breath. Bumpy's eyes followed the man who had shouted. He did not twitch. He did not mutter a curse. The air thickened, carrying a subtle warning that only those who understood the streets could feel. The insult had been loud, but the sentence would be quiet, private, and inevitable. Harlem had learned over generations. When Bumpy measured, he weighed lives carefully, but his decisions were absolute. The mob did not understand. They believed boldness could break the unspoken law. They were wrong. They had misread the quiet, the calm that stretched across Harlem's blocks like a shadow no one dared step into. Orders were whispered now, eyes darting, while Bumpy moved deliberately through the neighborhood, as if tracing the boundaries they were foolish enough to ignore. Every alley he passed, every stoop he nodded toward, reinforced the truth. Harlem was his, and it would not tolerate disrespect. The mob's audacity was recorded by the city itself, etched into bricks and lampposts, witnessed by men who owed Bumpy loyalty without question. In the theater of the streets, they had taken the stage uninvited, and the audience, the people who truly mattered, was watching closely. By dusk, the men who shouted the insult began to feel it. A tightness in the chest, a hesitation in the gait, a slow understanding that their bravado had made them visible in ways they could not undo. They did not yet see the method of the response, only that the silence from Bumpy Johnson was a kind of violence itself, a prelude to the reckoning he had already set in motion. That night, the insult became a mark. Harlem knew who had crossed the line, and who would pay the cost in ways unspoken but understood. Respect was not restored with a shout. It was claimed quietly, with inevitability, and Bumpy Johnson had already drawn the sentence. The city waited with him, calm, patient, knowing that when the time came, the lesson would be delivered, and it would be remembered forever. The moment came without fanfare. No sirens, no shouting, no blaze of guns. Just the streets of Harlem, still and waiting, and Bumpy Johnson moving with the inevitability of a tide. The men who had laughed, who had thought themselves untouchable, were unaware that their reckoning had already begun. Bumpy's steps were deliberate, measured, each one resonating authority. He did not hurry because there was no need. Time itself bent to the weight of his presence. The city watched, knowing that control had been ceded not through volume, but through silence. The calm before this storm carried more fear than any shouted threat ever could. He entered a dim room where the mob had gathered, unaware that their audacity had left them exposed. Bumpy's gaze swept across them, each man under a quiet interrogation, his judgment already rendered. They shifted nervously, thinking he might rage. They did not understand that true power required no theatrics. The moment for spectacle had passed long ago. With methodical efficiency, the lesson unfolded. There was no need for chaos. A glance here, a movement there, and the men realized their arrogance had led them straight into consequences they could neither escape nor resist. It was quick, precise, and absolute. The bodies of the insult, of the defiance, were removed from the equation quietly, leaving the message intact. Disrespect had a price, and Bumpy Johnson collected it personally. Outside, Harlem remained calm. Windows stayed lit, doors slightly ajar, the neighborhood bearing witness without intruding. The streets had seen enough violence to understand the patterns. They knew when a man acted from necessity, and when he acted from anger. Bumpy's control was complete because there had been no chaos, no noise, only inevitability. When he left the room, the air seemed heavier, the night darker. The message had been delivered without speech, without fanfare, and without doubt. Harlem exhaled collectively, relief mingling with respect. The lesson had been carved into memory, precise and undeniable. Bumpy Johnson walked back onto the streets, his coat brushing against the winter air, hands folded, expression calm. The city understood what had happened without needing to speak. Respect had been restored, order reasserted, and a quiet legacy reinforced. In Harlem, silence was sometimes deadlier than guns, and tonight it had spoken loudest of all. By morning, Harlem spoke in hushed tones, not in gossip, not in fear, but in reverence. The streets remembered what the night had taught them. Respect was earned, measured, and enforced not by chaos, but by a man who understood the weight of silence. Bumpy Johnson moved through the neighborhood as though nothing had changed. Shopkeepers opened doors, nodding subtly. Boys on corners tipped their heads. Elders lingered in doorways, watching, approving. The lesson had been delivered, and the city absorbed it without spectacle. Violence had occurred, yes, but it was the calm, the inevitability that lingered in memory. No one celebrated the men who had been removed from the streets. That was never the point. The lesson wasn't spectacle. It was principle. Harlem understood that order wasn't maintained by fear alone. It was sustained by loyalty, by awareness, and by a leader whose control never wavered. Stories of the insult and its consequences spread quietly, moving through stoops, barbershops, and tenement windows. Every retelling emphasized the same truth. Bumpy Johnson had acted not in anger, but in measured response. His power was rooted in restraint, his legacy in the certainty that disrespect had consequences. Years later, men would recall that night with a chill, not because of who fell, but because of the way it had been done. Quietly, efficiently, without the need for rage to define him. Harlem didn't remember bodies. It remembered authority, presence, and the unshakable principle that loyalty to the streets and respect for those who ruled them was non-negotiable. Bumpy Johnson's name became more than a marker of fear. It became a symbol, a standard, a quiet force that shaped behavior and ensured that the lessons of the streets endured long after individual lives had passed. The insult was gone. The message remained, and Harlem never forgot the man who had made silence more deadly than the loudest gunshot.